grateful for you bringing your amazing spirit and your beautiful music and your beautiful voices here today with us. We are in our second Sunday of the month of July, and as you know, our July theme is spiritual living through open communication. And so a big part of today is an expansion of what we kind of kicked off and started last Sunday. So I'm going to invite everybody to take a nice long deep breath in. And in that deep breath in, what that does for me personally is it gives me this greater depth of feeling and understanding and receiving of being even more grounded to this moment, to the truth of my being, to what it is that I am and what I'm all about in this moment. And so it's a really powerful symbolic gesture that I feel I can gift myself with at any moment. I can stop and take a breath. Because as we discovered, I believe it was last Sunday, that I revealed that for me personally, life is really about just being more aware today than I was yesterday. And to be more aware today than I was yesterday, I need to have within my consciousness and psyche and within my heart that's full of intention, I need to have this desire to pay attention, to be open, to be aware, to not be afraid of anything that might come across my radar, my experience, my life, to not be afraid of that, but to be aware of it. And then I get to do this really blessed experience for myself, and I get to decide for myself how I want to perceive that, whatever it is, how I want it to impact me, if I want it to impact me at all. I get to choose how. I get to choose why, based on anything and everything that's a part of my whole complete and total being. You guys with me so far? Right on. So let's everybody take a nice long deep breath in again. And the reason why I'm doing all this breathing is, as you also know, we are a part of a greater organization called Centers for Spiritual Living, and we are in our second year of the organization coming together and visioning and providing themes and kind of talk concepts. And the theme and the talk concept for today was racism to Gracism. And I will tell you that I don't always use the talk titles that they've provided for us because sometimes it kind of matches what's going on and what I'm feeling in our community, and sometimes it doesn't. Reason why I'm doing all this breathing here is because I don't know about you, but sometimes that can be a tough topic to talk about. And I don't know about you, but I get it that it's my choice to view it as a tough topic to talk about. Because I got to do a little dance. I got to do a little dance this week with myself. I got to go through a whole gamut of feelings of, do I keep the topic title? Do I not? What's coming through? What feels right? What feels good? What's wanting to happen right here and now? What wants to be birthed and experienced through us in this very moment with each one of you in your seat today? And it came through pretty loud and clear. No, you need to go with this. And I was like, oh my God, what am I going to do? It's a tricky subject. It's a sensitive subject. It's a subject that opens us up for judgment. You know, and nobody really likes to be judged. And can you imagine when you are about what you are about and when you're going through your day, imagine what it's like if you've got people in your world that cheerlead for you and say, you got this and you are doing great. Especially if you're learning something new, it's awesome to have somebody or a lot of people to see the truth within you and to say, I believe in you and you can do this, right? I mean, go there. Doesn't that feel wonderful? And it's so much easier for us to step even greater into our excellence when that is the feeling, when that's the nature, right? I mean, I know it is for me personally. So what if you've got this sense of being judged all the time, or looked down upon, or thinking you're less than, or that people really don't believe in you, or if what they do believe in you isn't necessarily what you know to be in your heart to be true, and you're like, but I'm not like that. That's not me. You're defining me a certain way, and that's not who I am. It's kind of hard to step into a life of excellence when that's going on. Would you all kind of sort of agree with me on that? Yeah, it is. And so that's what we find, that's what I have found this week in really contemplating and moving into a greater depth of awareness and awakeness regarding this topic. You know, our premise for this week and for this month is that we stand together in a shared commitment and devotion to our spiritual principles, our spiritual practices, and our values. That we communicate openly with each other in an atmosphere of collaboration and inclusion. And what that means to me is when we openly communicate with each other in an atmosphere of collaboration and inclusion, it means that I honor and respect you. I honor the fact that you are a divine being expressing, and I don't have a previous expectation for you to look a certain way or to sound a certain way or to show up a certain way. I mean, obviously, barring something like you have a contract and somebody's showing up to do something, I mean, that's a whole different thing. There's expectations there. But that's not what I'm talking about. I know you know that. So where I'm going with this is this. We have a very sacred and profound journey to walk this morning. And I am inviting you to walk it with me in a sense of energy that you may have never experienced before. Would you be willing to walk this journey with me with an open mind and an open heart and an open soul, without any conditioned belief or judgment or understanding or entitlement or title or any of that kind of stuff? Would you be willing to do that? Because we've got some exploration to do, and that's how discoveries are made. We get to go spelunking into the minds of our culture and society, into our very hearts and souls, and we get to kind of spelunk what it is that is right and true for us and what isn't. Because today, I want to be more aware than I was yesterday. And the best way I know to do that is to have open communication, is to explore and discover, and to maybe not always take the easy road, right? So I did modify the talk title just a little bit. We are moving from racism to gracism. What is mine to do? So let's go to the first slide. That's a pretty one. He always changes them up, and I never get to see them. So I want to go first to the guy holding the microphone. Dennis Leary, he says, racism isn't born, folks, it's taught. I have a 2-year-old son. Know what he hates? Naps. End of list. I love that. I always laugh out loud every time I see that and hear that. You know what he hates? Naps. That's it. That's it. And so then in the other picture we've got racism is something you learn, not something that you're born with. How many of you would agree with me or agree with that in this room? Yes. We aren't born with that. We're taught that. And there's all kinds of reasons why we're taught that, and we're not really here this morning to go into those reasons. We're here to move from racism to gracism, not to put a whole bunch more energy into it. That's the last thing I want to do. But sometimes, you know, when we live life, and I'm more aware today than I was yesterday, it's because I've paid attention to what's come up onto my radar. And in paying attention, I've dropped down into the center of my being, and I've connected with that spiritual essence that I know that I am one with. And I get to do that work. I get to discern, is this going to be my truth today? Is this going to impact how I speak to myself and make choices in my life? And is it going to impact how I interact with others? That's my choice. So there's a distinct difference, I believe, in investing energy into that which we no longer want to exist or grow or be created, to being aware of what is, so that we can definitely invest the energy into what we desire to become. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So that's what we're going to do today. So let's go to the next slide. Slide, please. So here we go. I love this because, as you know, animals are very near and dear to my heart, especially doggies. And here's a couple of dogs that's like, hey, racism, that's a human business. No other species on the planet gets involved in that kind of stuff, just human beings, right? Well, there's a reason why I'm showing you this slide. Let's go to the next slide. So in my preparation for my talk this week, I found some signs. Here we have that sign up there in the corner, and it's so repulsive to me that I can't even read them out loud. But you'll see that Lone Star Restaurant Association in Dallas, Texas had that sign up, and then we've got a sign up here that was posted, and then we've got some water fountains where there's some signs above them. And then we've got some signs that were hanging outside, and a sign ordered by the police department that was probably in some kind of government building, I'm guessing. But the reason why I'm putting those up here is this. There are people in this room that were alive during the time where these signs were public, where they were actually used to guide and direct people. I myself have never personally seen signs like this posted. It just happens to be the generation that I'm in. Yet I've seen other signs through behavior. So being able to prepare for this talk this week has really opened my eyes and my heart and my soul to a greater understanding of that which I didn't have a greater understanding of before. You see, because I wasn't alive during the time that these signs were actually public and directing people, but there's people in this room who have been, we've had a little bit of a different life experience. What makes up my understanding or lack of understanding around how certain things are continued to unfold within our society and our culture for control and power, I have a hard time understanding that, yet I totally celebrate the fact that we don't have these signs posted anymore in public, right? I mean, how cool is that? We have made progress, ladies and gentlemen. I am so excited about that, because from someone in my generation, they're there for a long time, because this as early as it wasn't taught to us in school. I really didn't get the sense that we had made much progress until I really started diving deep and researching this talk. So I would like to take a moment to really honor that. These signs don't exist out in public anymore. Now, we do have other things that go on, mostly behavioral related, and that is what it is, and that's why we're having this conversation this morning. But I do want to take a moment to celebrate that we are making progress as a human species, as a humankind, and I am so grateful for that. My hat is off to the progress that we are made, the progress that we are making. I'd also like to point out, now here's an interesting thing. In a lot of the sign, and I didn't, there were a lot that I didn't put up here, but what's the deal with the dogs? I mean, I was really confused by this. I mean, why are dogs also kept from everything, which is why I put the white dog and the black dog hugging each other. It's like, I don't get it, but I think we've made progress in that arena as well. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, I just think that's an interesting tidbit. What's the deal with dogs? It's like, no this, no that, and also no dogs. Okay, well, I think we've moved on from that. That's a good thing. So, looking up some definitions, I think it's important to share some definitions about what we're actually wrapping our mind and heart and soul around this morning. And that would be, I'd like to start out with the definition of Gracism. Now, when I typed in definition of Gracism on Google, do you know what popped up? Do you mean racism? Wasn't that funny? I'm like, oh, dear Lord. And that's okay, because I need to pay attention to that. So the first thing that popped up was, don't you mean racism? And it gave me all the definitions of racism. And I'm like, no, I want the definition of Gracism. Well, let's start out with grace. Grace is simple elegance or refinement of movement. And in our Inward Journey Prac 1 class right now, we are reading a book called Elegant Choices. And it's a fabulous book. And it really does kind of boil down to that, folks, doesn't it? Elegant choices. Gracism, to me, is living a life that's full of elegant choices. And so that's the definition of grace. And then we have an additional definition of grace that was supplied in our materials, which I think is hilarious because a Reverend Ellen Grace wrote it. So, like attracts like there. It's kind of funny. So this is what she wrote. Surrender of the sense of separation does not mean extinction of the individual. It means divine action, grace, flowing freely without the conflict of self-will. Yeah, that's pretty good, isn't it? Grace. And then we have Jesus. You know, Jesus says, empty yourself and I will fill thee. So that's the consciousness that we want to embrace, possessed by an active, mystical purpose. Can you just picture yourself being possessed by an active, mystical purpose? I can. That's the kind of possession I'd like. So let's just imagine that for a minute. You follow guidance, releasing your expectation of outcomes and how you want those to be, and you live with great faith. You continue devotion to your own inner work. You surrender, and your surrender tells the divine that you are ready for experiences that grow you and expand you and allow you to ascend. That's pretty awesome, huh? I think that's pretty awesome. So racism. Now let's go to racism. Racism cannot be fully explained as an expression of prejudice alone. It's a system involving cultural messages and institutional policies and practices, as well as the beliefs and actions of individuals. That's the definition that I pulled for racism. So I'm going to ask you this now. By show of hands, I'm being serious here. Do you feel that racism exists on this planet and within our country? Do you feel it does? Okay. In knowing that, do you have the desire to eliminate and dissolve racism so that it no longer has an impact on any part of our culture and society? Okay. Okay, so we've acknowledged that it exists, and we've acknowledged that we have the desire for it to no longer exist, right? We know that. So here's the third question. What does that look like? What does that look like to you? What does dissolving racism so it no longer has an impact on our culture and our society and our country and our world, what does that look like to you? Like imagine going into a meeting and the only thing on the agenda is we're dissolving racism today. What would those action items look like? What would they be? Anybody? It all starts with me. That is so true, Ross. It all starts with me. So what are some of the me things that that would be important to concentrate and focus on there if it all starts with me?
Speaking up against stereotypes.
Speaking up against stereotypes. That's powerful. Thank you, Rhonda. Amen to that. Yes, ma'am. A shift in focus. Yes. A shift in focus. Kim. Yes. Very good. She said, and if somebody does a racist joke or something like that, that you kind of point it out gently, or maybe provide what it is that we would like to create, you know, a world and a society and culture without racism. Yes, Sandra?
The willingness to be uncomfortable.
Yes.
When the subject comes up.
Yes, the willingness to be uncomfortable when the subject comes up, just like me now. Well, I'm not uncomfortable now, but I was a little bit earlier. And I'll tell you why. You know, I don't tell many people, I do more now probably than ever, but I don't tell many people that I'm from Kentucky, that I was born and raised in Kentucky, because there's people that have this preconceived idea of all these people from Kentucky, that we walk around barefoot and pregnant, right? I mean, isn't that generally the preconceived idea? And that is so not true. The thing is when society provides these preconceived ideas, there's just one story being told, and there's just one perception being absorbed. And most of the time, it's nowhere near the truth or reality. And because of that, culture gets dismissed. Beautiful, rich, beautiful culture gets dismissed. I know people born in the early 50s and late 50s into Hispanic families where it was highly discouraged to speak in Spanish. And so think about that. Think about my generation. I went through, 5 years of Spanish, and I still can't speak Spanish. I mean, I would love to be able to speak Spanish. How awesome would it have been to have grown up in a household where the elders, where the tias and the moms and the abuelitas all spoke Spanish? How cool would that be? Yet these children were highly discouraged to speak Spanish. So I get this sense that there's this culture and these beautiful roots that go without being honored, without being extended on through generation and generation. And I have to say, I kind of grieve that a little bit. Yet I'm kind of doing the same thing, aren't I? There's all kinds of rich culture that I grew up in by being born and raised in Kentucky. But most people probably don't know about it. And the types of foods and the music and how we lived our life and how we created community, it's very rich. Yet what is it in me that keeps me from sharing that? It's that notion, that preconceived idea, those labels, and not ever wanting to, because like I said, most of the time, 99.9%, those labels are incorrect, not truth, and not factual, and not reality anyway. But man, how much of who we are do we stifle because we have this fear of being labeled or categorized by our culture? It's a little freaky, isn't it? It's a little weird. It's a little weird, but we're gonna work through that. It's a little weird. So let's go to the next slide, please. So here's some stuff, and Kim brought this up probably. See, racism today isn't out for us to read on a sign. It's very subtle. And I know this is hard to read, so I'm going to read some of them to you. But here's how racism is a little subtle for us. The woman is saying to the woman with the baby, "Oh, is that your little brother?" She says to the same person that's of a different race, "Oh, is that your son?" It's subtle how this is happening in society. "What colleges have you applied for?" says the first frame. Second frame, "Will you be the first person in your family to graduate high school?" Subtle, isn't it? Here's, "What's your major?" Second frame, "Are you the first person in your family to go to college?" "Do you have kids?" I'm imagining that's a coworker because they're drinking coffee and stuff. And then the next one, "How many kids do you have?" Subtle, very, very subtle. Last one, what does your husband do? And then the next one, my God, do people really talk like this anymore? Is the father still in the picture? I mean, okay, so we all know this goes on, right? And I don't really want to put a lot of energy or invest a lot of energy into it, but it's kind of what Kim brought up when I asked the question. It's being aware of when that takes place. You know, I worked for several years for Girls Inc. It's a beautiful nonprofit organization that's internationally affiliated, and our vision, our goal is to inspire all girls to be strong, smart, and bold. And so as a part of the directing of the programs there, we are trained to keep an eye out for how society and culture, kind of needs a facelift, kind of needs to be brought up in ascension in the way that we vibrate at a higher level in energy. And so I was in Barnes & Noble's the other day. Don't go there very often, but I was looking for a periodical that I needed. And I go to the periodical stand. Like I said, I don't go there very often, so this was kind of a surprise to me. They had on one side of the periodical stand, which runs the full length of the wall, women's interests. And on the other end of the periodical stand, men's interests. Now, some of you, maybe most of you, would be like, "So what's the big deal?" Well, to me, it was a big deal. One of the periodicals I used to subscribe to all the time, the Sun magazine, was under the men's interest section. And I'm just like, who the heck decides what's a man's interest for periodicals and a women's interest for periodicals? Who decides how you change your conversation based on the color of the skin of the person you're talking to? Who does that? And why? Why do we do that? Because it's kind of ingrained in us. It's like that slide that I showed you. We're not born this way. We're taught to be this way. But by God, that is really good news. And I know I mentioned this to you last week when I told you the little story about Maurice and his son from Korea, Duquan. Remember I told you that story last week? And so the really good news is because we're taught this, we can change it. We're not hardwired for this at all. We get to make choices and we get to change it. And that is a really awesome thing. But it's very subtle. So I know I have shared with you stories of one of our teens that has now gone on to be a young adult. I shared with you her story last fall that she told about going through, what do they call that? The LGBTQ conversion therapy. When she was a young teenager, her parents didn't know any better. It was covered under their insurance, and she had to go through conversion therapy. She wrote a little story describing and detailing what that was like. So this same teen, now a young adult, who is thriving in New York City, she's an amazing master chef and just is living a wonderful life. And she just posted to us this week, just a few days ago. Can you pull up? Yeah, the next one. Good, I'm going in order. Who'd have thought? The next one. She had posted this pic on Instagram. You know, can you read what the sign says? Stonewall wasn't about marriage equality, it was about police violence, Black Lives Matter. She posted that on her Instagram account, and it was immediately taken off. And she says that it was taken off because, let me tell you why. She got a message saying this photo was removed because it didn't meet community standards. Who's making those standards? Whose community standards? So it's subtle. We don't have those signs hanging in our streets and in our government buildings anymore, or in our restaurants, or wherever else they were hanging, because I wasn't alive at the time, I can't tell you. But we have some other subtle things going on. And when I ask the question, like you're walking into a meeting, what's the agenda item? I mean, when the whole purpose of the meeting is to dissolve and end the impact of racism on our society and culture today. What are some of the things that you do? And some of you mentioned it begins with me. Or you point out when people are telling racist jokes, you know, you make them aware. Well, can we really make anybody aware of anything? I mean, I'm not sure. I'm really asking that question. Can we make people aware? Or what's the best way we can make people aware? Let's put it that way. By example, exactly. By example. So it's subtle, folks. You know, I having been a part of different programs where I get to teach diversity training and get to point things out, there's all this energy that comes up and shows us that deep down, if we were raised in America and we are Caucasian, we are racist. Even if we don't want to be, even if I would never, ever, ever want to be labeled that, in my upbringing in Kentucky, I was taught things and learned things and ways of responding and communicating that one would consider racist. So it's to be more aware, right? It's to live by example. It's to find all those areas within us that no longer have an impact of how we would respond or how we would talk to somebody based on maybe the color of their skin or their religion. You know, I talked about a story. The danger or the entanglement kind of comes from when we only have one story. And there's this beautiful woman that, her name is Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. And she's a storyteller, and she's from Nigeria. And I want to share a little bit about her story, or one of her stories with you, to kind of drive this point home, because she's a beautiful writer. But she says, I'd like to share with you my thoughts on the danger of a single story. She grew up on a university campus in eastern Nigeria. Her mother says that she started reading very, very early on, age 2, but she thinks it was really 4. So what she read was what was available to read, which were British and American children's books. She said she was also an early writer. So when she began to write at about age 7, she wrote stories in pencil and crayons and would color illustrations about them. And she said my poor mother was obligated to read them all. Yet she wrote exactly the kind of stories that she had been reading. So that meant all of her characters were white and blue-eyed, that they played in the snow, they ate apples, and they talked a lot about the weather. Okay? Now, despite the fact that she lived in Nigeria, she had never been outside of Nigeria. They didn't have snow there. They ate mangoes. They didn't eat apples. And they never talked about the weather because there was no need to. But those were the stories, the only stories that she wrote, because that's what the only stories were that she was writing or reading. She said, my characters also drank a lot of ginger beer because the characters in the British books drank a lot of ginger beer. Never mind that I had no idea what ginger beer was and I'd never had it before. So she said for many years afterwards, she would have a desperate desire to taste ginger beer. That's beside the point. But she says what this demonstrates is how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story, particularly children. She said, because all that I had read in books where characters were foreign, I had become convinced that books by their very nature had to have foreigners in them and had to be about things which I could not personally identify with. Wow. Right? Because what happens when we personally identify with things? It's almost like I feel the lights go on inside of me. I feel myself entering a new zone, a new level of awareness. So, okay, here we go. Already she's realizing, wow, I wasn't having that identifying feature occurring within me and within my life. So then she goes on to say, now things changed when I discovered African books. There weren't many of them available, and they weren't quite as easy to find, but I discovered them. And she had a mental shift occur in her perception in literature. She realized that people like me, girls with the skin the same color of chocolate of mine, and those with kinky hair could not form ponytails, could also exist in literature. How cool is that? So she started writing about things she recognized. And of course, as you can imagine, her writing blossomed. So she says, now, I love those American and British books. They stirred my imagination. They opened up new worlds for me. But the unintended consequence was that I did not know that people like me could exist in literature. So we've kind of made that point. So she says, you know, we lived in a kind of a middle class type of family life. And because they lived in this middle type class of family life, they needed some live-in domestic help. And they got a new person, and his name was Feed. The only thing my mother told us about him, and she was 8 when they got Feed, when Feed moved in with them, the only thing that the family told them about him is that his family was very poor. So my mother sent yams and rice and our old clothes to his family, and when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, finish your food. You know what? People like Feed's family are going hungry. So then one Saturday, we went to his village, and his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brothers had made. And I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was that they were poor, and that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else than what I had been told about them, which was they were poor. So their poverty was my single story of them. Years later, I thought about this when I left Nigeria and went to the university in the United States. I was 19. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I had learned to speak English so well and was confused when I told her that English was the language spoken in Nigeria. She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music and was extremely disappointed when I produced a tape of Mariah Carey. Can you believe it? But what struck me was this. She felt sorry for me even before she had met me. Her default position toward me as an African was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any possible way. And no possibility of feeling more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection of human equals. Do you see where I'm going here? That single story and how powerful it has an effect on our lives. And so she said that before she went to the U.S., she didn't consciously identify as African. But in the U.S., whenever Africa came up, people would turn to her like she was the utter expert of Africa. She thought that was really interesting. She also thought it was kind of funny because a lot of people would call it a country, and it's not a country. So she was like learning all these different nuances that kind of came with just from where she was born. So she said, after I'd spent some time in the United States, I began to understand my roommate's response. If I had not grown up in Nigeria, and if all I knew about Africa were from the popular images, I too would think Africa was a place of beautiful landscapes, beautiful animals, and incomprehensible people, fighting senseless wars, dying of poverty and AIDS, and unable to speak for themselves, and waiting to be saved by a kind white foreigner.
Yes.
Right? I would see Africans in the same way that I, as a child, had seen Feed's family. The single story of Africa ultimately comes, I think, from Western literature. And now, here is a quote from the writing of a London merchant called John Locke, who sailed to West Africa in 1561 and kept a fascinating account of his voyage. And referring back to those black Africans as beasts who have no houses, he writes, there are also people without heads, having their mouths and eyes in their breasts. You see, because their face was black, that's what it looked like to him. Bizarre, right? But we take this account, especially from someone that goes far off and comes back. Does that remind you of anything, like Native Americans and, the beginning of that? We take this account and observe it and know it to be true, and then maybe aren't open to having any other kind of experience about that, like she did with Feed and his family and how her roommate had with her. But then it gets a little bit deeper. It goes a little bit deeper, because I'm gonna go jump ahead here. But she says, I must quickly add that I too am just as guilty in the question of this single story. A few years ago, I visited Mexico from the U.S., and the political climate in the U.S. at the time was tense. And there were debates going on about immigration, and as often happens in America, immigration became synonymous with Mexicans. So there were endless stories of Mexicans as people who were fleecing the healthcare system, sneaking across the border, being arrested, and that sort of thing. So I remember walking around on my first day in Guadalajara, watching the people go to work, rolling up tortillas in the marketplace, smoking, laughing. I remember first feeling slight surprise, and then I was overwhelmed with shame. I realized that I had been so immersed in the media coverage of Mexicans that they had become one thing in my mind, an abject immigrant. And I had bought into the single story of Mexicans that I could not have been more ashamed of myself. So that is how to create a single story. Show a person as one thing and as one thing only, over and over and over again, until that's what they've become in your mind, and that's how you respond to them, and that's how you think about them, until you have a different experience, right? Well, do we have to wait until we have a different experience? Because in our teaching, our first principle is oneness and unity, and I am one with you. You and I are brother and sister. We are one of each other. It's like the story, the single story, continues to come up and has an impact. And I would say that would need to be first on our agenda list in that meeting that we enter into, where the number one objective goal of that meeting was to dissolve, diminish the impact of racism on our society and culture. It would be to get rid of the single story in every aspect of our life. I mean, here we have this beautiful, educated, wise, intelligent woman from Nigeria that also fell prey to it. None of us are outside of the scope and realm for that to happen. So for example, like you guys know my favorite TV show, right? Northern Exposure. I just can't help it. Each episode's like a mystical, sacred experience. So I have to share it. But in one episode, they're getting ready to celebrate Thanksgiving. Now there's an example of a single story experience, isn't it? Right? I know, and I remember the story of Thanksgiving that was taught to me when I grew up in school. So in this little town of Sicily in Alaska, the majority of the population were natives. They had a very different story of Thanksgiving. So the way that town celebrated Thanksgiving, and poor Joel, Fleischman, the doctor, it was his first Thanksgiving there, poor guy. So he's walking across the street, he sees Ed, he's like, hi, Ed. Ed's like, hi, Dr. Fleischman, and he throws a tomato at him, and the tomato explodes on his beautiful Perry Ellis white shirt. And Joel is beside himself. He's like, oh my God. He goes to the office and he's talking to Marilyn, his office assistant, who's also a native, and he's just going on and on. It was merciless. He had a smile on his face. He wished me happy Thanksgiving, and then poof, just threw this tomato at me. And he goes on and on and on. And he finally asked, why? What's this all about? And Marilyn said, well, you have a very different account of Thanksgiving. To our people, something very different occurred to us around what's being celebrated in that holiday. And so how we work through and honor our feelings about that is we throw tomatoes at white people. Because it resembles blood. She said, but it doesn't hurt like it hurt our people when they came and raped, pillaged, made us sick, and destroyed and took our lands. And so, what do you think Fleischmann did? Now, this is an important learning here. But Fleischmann was beside himself because I'm not a white person. I'm a Jewish person. If there's anybody that knows anything about, going through something like that, it's me and my people. So he automatically jumped to, well, I can't be identified as that because I'm a Jewish person. So do you see how, my God, there's not a single one of us in this room that is 100% Caucasian white. We know that, right? So it's mind-blowing, this single story theme that continues to show up in our lives. What if today, being more aware than I was yesterday, I come into a greater realization of the oneness that I share with my brothers and sisters that walk this planet, and I respect them, and I see them, and I honor their culture, and I want to be their cheerleader. I want to see their excellence. I want to believe in them, not the single story that I've been taught to believe, and then I get to respond to them based on that story. I am here claiming a different experience. I'm coming out of that office knowing an even greater understanding of how, as Ross said, it's up to me, of how I can best eliminate and dissolve the impacts of racism on our society and culture. It's pretty amazing, isn't it? I think. It's mind-blowing. It's been quite a dance for me this week. So I want to go, this is a powerful slide, I want to share it. Let's go to 6, Malcolm X. I think this is a pretty powerful statement. He says, if you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and pull it out 6 inches, that's not progress. If you pull it all the way out, that's not progress. The progress comes from healing the wound that the blow made. They haven't begun to pull the knife out. They won't even admit the knife is there. Okay? So it's kind of like throwing the tomatoes at the white man for the Thanksgiving in Sicily, Alaska. There's this time where, and I believe, and I know that it's happening, because I know in my heart that we are ascending. I know in my heart that we have a conscious awareness that is vibrating at a higher frequency of oneness and love and harmony and joy and peace and power and light, all those God qualities, than in the past. I know every single day human civilization is more aware than it was yesterday. I know that. And do you know how I know that? I must know that. Because that is what I must know in order to experience it. In order to allow that dissolution to occur in every aspect and ounce of our psyche and our consciousness. So there's so much, and I'm out of time, so I'm going to cut to the chase here. So let's go to Let's go to 18. My 18. I don't know what it is for you. How do we stop racism? We stop talking about it. I'm going to stop calling you a white man, and I'm going to ask you to stop calling me a black man. Now, what I think he's saying here is not necessarily we're going to stop talking about it, like push it under the rug and put our head in the sand and think that it doesn't exist, because when I asked the question at the beginning of this talk, every single one of you raised your hand. But we know, especially in this teaching, that which we place our conscious awareness on grows and expands and thrives. So what if we stopped identifying with people based on the single story model? What if we went back to center and allowed that to propel how we interact on our society and culture? How about we embrace all the different beautiful cultures that we have, and we start learning more about them and experiencing more about them and celebrating them? And I'm not saying that we don't, so don't hear that in that way, please, because that's not my intention. I mean, if anybody is doing it, I think the folks in this room are doing it. Yet, like Ross said, how do we do this? It starts with me. And I know that it is truly up to us to dissolve and end the impact of racism that it has on our culture and in our society. I know it begins with us. Let's go to the next slide. So here we go. Your work is not to drag the world kicking and screaming into a new awareness. Your job is to simply do your work, sacredly, secretly. And those with eyes to see and ears to hear will respond. Now, I know that might be hard to read for some people. I know some people like to make a scene and create a stir and point things out. And I'm not saying that there's not a place for that. But what I am saying is, I know with every ounce of my being that everything is energy. And I know that where I place my attention, that energy will grow. And it is truly up to me to decide where I place that energy and invest it. And so if I have myself busy looking for areas where it shows up in my life and only seeing in areas where it shows up in my life, I am only going to attract more of that showing up in my life. It's kind of like, though, what Malcolm X said. If you pull it out a few inches, it's not healing it. So I'm not saying we deny it. We allow it to be what it is right now and not resist what is, but we invest in what we want and what we want to have be. Let's go to the next slide, please. Oh, okay, not that one. So, Bishop Shelby Spong, slide 9. Here we go. Love this man. If you haven't read his books, please do. God is not a Christian, God is not a Jew, or a Muslim, or a Hindu, or a Buddhist. I honor my tradition, I walk through my tradition, but I don't believe my tradition defines God. It only points me to God. So that's the other thing is your beliefs, your divinity, your connection with Spirit itself is extremely personal. It's extremely unique, and it is what will point you to the divine. It is what will propel you to invest your energy into that which will dissolve racism and bring us into Gracism. You see, grace, God, divinity. Let's focus on that. Our Rumiism for the day, I can't pass up our Rumiism 13. Going quick. We got burritos to eat. If you find me not within you, you will never find me, for I have been with you from the beginning of me. That is how I feel about my brothers and sisters. All of my brothers and sisters are within me. If I can't find a single one of the human beings that are living and breathing and walking this planet within me, then guess what? Because you've all been with me since the beginning. And you will always be with me forever into eternity because we are one. And so that single story, I'm inviting you to dissolve the single story that's in your life. And remember the beautiful soul from Nigeria. I mean, my goodness, you'd think if it was on the front scope of anybody's experience, wouldn't it be her? Because she's gone through a few of these experiences already. But no, she got sucked right in. So let's not get sucked in. Let's be strong. Let's be strong in what we know to be true. Let's go to one more. 17. Once you realize that all comes from within, that the world in which you live in is not projected onto you, but by you, your fear comes to an end. Okay? So I know I don't have time to go into the specifics of that, but if you find yourself getting all riled up about something, I'm inviting you to breathe. To take the breath and move into an experience where you can be more aware in that moment than you were the moment before. Because if something's getting you all riled up, there's something within you that you are projecting. There's something within you that's coming forth for you to make a choice about. And you're the only one that can do it. All right, so let's go to the last slide so we can say our affirmation for the month. Thank you for hanging with me. Everybody ready to say this together? I recognize, honor, and celebrate the unique variations and expressions that show up as the divine. This includes me and everyone around me, and so it is. You guys are up. Thank you.